And to her right is Mr. John Nolan. He is the Distinguished Professor of Law at Pace Law University and the founder and executive director, is that your title, of the Pace Land Use Law Center?
I'm counsel now. We've got other people that direct it.
Oh, okay. And one of the things that the Pace Land Use Law Center does, one of the many things that they do, is they help train local elected officials in sustainability law and sustainability-related land use practices. So beyond that, I think I kind of gave you a heads up on some of what he does. Oh, he served as a consultant to President Carter's Council on Development Choices in the 80s, and then President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development. Please welcome Mr. Professor John Nolan. So, there you go. You can. You have to hold it pretty close, a little closer than you want to. So I'll just open up asking our panelists if you could, as everybody gets their questions ready, I'll be coming up to the audience. Do you have any reaction to the film? Think something you want to point out or comment on? One item from the film that particularly spoke to you?
I wish that Al Gore could be here with us. Sorry, we're not him. I, as a local elected official, feel like it's very important to be taking action on climate change at the local level, especially given the climate of our federal government at this time. So I think that a lot of people have become engaged and interested on the local level and are beginning to recognize that so much can happen and be implemented on the local level. And we also have a state that is doing a lot of encouragement and support for that. So I think that reinforces this. And it's amazing to feel part of the global community through this, for me.
One of the things that was not mentioned about the Paris Accord is that it embraced what they call nationally determined contributions, or nationally
Can't hear you.
Nearer. Hold it a little closer, please, John. It's uncomfortably close.
Okay, can you hear this?
Yeah.
Okay, you were right about that, of course, Mayor. The Paris Accord embraced what it was called nationally determined contributions to climate change. And that was a huge change because it did exactly what Nancy was talking about. It said if local governments and state governments and individuals and colleges and civic organizations can figure out ways to lower their emissions, those will count toward the country's contributions to the Paris Accord. And that was a huge change from what happened in Kyoto, where we embraced a worldwide cap and trade program that went nowhere. We couldn't make that work. And so now we've unleashed the power of 40,000 local governments and 330 million people, and that's pretty exciting.
One of the things the film didn't mention, when Paris was ratified, two countries were out, Nicaragua and Syria. Nicaragua and Syria have now joined. Mr. Trump has stated his intention that we're going to pull out, but what you need to know is that the United States can't even file the documents to pull out until November of this year. The very first day that we legally can get out of that treaty is the day after the next presidential election. So, and I have to say, there are good Republicans in this fight and good Democrats in this fight. So I'm not being polemic. If Mr. Trump should change his mind, and or if someone else should get elected within 30 days, we could be right back in the Paris Accord. The other thing you need to know is that there is real expectation that the United States is actually going to meet its Paris Climate Accord obligations because of what's happening at the local level, the state level, and the county level. You also need to know that China and India are on track to overachieve their Paris Climate Accord commitments.
Okay, I'm sure we have some questions from folks in the audience. Susie, did you want to jump in with your question? Is that where you have to have your seat?
No.
Yes.
So my question is, well, probably must have been Nancy, just because you're an elected official. I'm really curious to know what's going on in the world of divestment from fossil fuels, individual villages and towns, and is there anything overarching in Westchester County and anything overarching in New York State so that we can all divest, because the money doesn't come out, it's still going in.
In Westchester County, I'm participating in a group called Sustainable Westchester. And it's a nonprofit that has the members that are all municipalities in the county. And they are coming together and participating with Sustainable Westchester, which has been aggregating all of us together to find better, cheaper, cleaner ways to provide energy. So one of those programs, the biggest program is called Westchester Power. And 23 municipalities in the county signed up for Westchester Power, which was an automatic change to your supply of energy. So whether it was Con Ed or NYSEG or whoever, if your community signed up for Westchester Power, all the residents in that community were defaulted into the new energy source. And for 19 of those, they chose the green option, which was renewable energy credits. So that was automatically creating over 100,000 households of demand for green energy. So that was great. If you don't know whether your community participates in Westchester Power and you want them to, please go to the website of Sustainable Westchester or speak to your elected officials, because that is a major effort by Sustainable Westchester. Another collective aggregate program they've done is that they've gone out and gotten better pricing for electric vehicles so that anyone who lives in Westchester can purchase an electric vehicle at a great discount, because they aggregated all the demand together and went and shopped that around. And finally, I'll add one more thing, and that is the state of New York is offering grants of up to 80% of the cost of an electric vehicle charging station. And those are due May 31st. My community is applying for 4 individual charging stations, and we have finally leased 2 electric vehicles. I could spend the rest of your night and weekend talking about the things that we're doing in the town of Mamaroneck and in the county, but I know I better let my colleagues speak too.
If you haven't yet found time to go to the Sustainable Westchester website, I'll just let you know that there's my friend in town government, Dana Levenberg, and we in village government. We are in the community aggregation, the Westchester Power Program with the 100% renewable. We were among the first meetings to do it. So if you're in Austining, then you were always a Con Ed customer, then you defaulted to 100% renewable. But Dana, do you want to plug some of the really great stuff that is happening in the town of Austining also, because you just had a ribbon cutting on Saturday. So no, I'll stop talking. Do it, please, Dana. Tell everybody.
No, we are a part of Community Choice Aggregation, and we actually applied for the electric vehicle charging station credit from New York State last year. So we cut the ribbon on 3 new electric vehicle charging stations in the town of Austining. One is at Angle Park in the parking lot for right near the train station. That's a town parking lot. The other one is at Cedar Lane Park, right across from Cedar Lane Art Center. And the third is in Ryder Park, sort of as you go in. So those are available to people, and of course the electric vehicle credits are available through New York State, through the federal government. And I think even Nissan has some deal right now with their Leaf. We also purchased an electric vehicle for the town for our fleet, and we're hoping to purchase a van when those become available and powerful enough to utilize for municipal use. And we got a whole lot of other things going, but I'm not going to take time away from the panelists.
I just wanted to add one other thing from Sustainable Westchester, and that is happening throughout Westchester, and that is the Solarize programs. They have been, again, aggregating communities together to go out and get better pricing on solar installations for residents. And we took advantage of it in my household, in our community, and we had 72 households sign up for solar power. That is a really terrific effort that's going on and can happen in every single community in the Westchester County. And we also are now embarking on something called community solar. For those folks who can't do solar in their own home because they don't have a perfect angle, or they have too many trees, or you live in an apartment, there's so many reasons it might not work perfectly. We're now creating solar in a spot that will give you the opportunity to buy that solar energy from that spot. In my town, we're looking at the roof of our ice rink, which is this big flat roof, and everyone wants to put solar panels on it, which is fantastic, and we have an affordable housing development right next to it, and so we can provide lower cost energy to that affordable housing, lower cost green renewable energy to that affordable housing area.
That's great. Yes, did you have a question?
We also, as another sustainable Westchester program, and we've taken advantage, fortunately, of the Solarize program here in Ossining and I think surrounding towns. We also have Lauren Boyce with us. Hi, Lauren. You want to talk a little bit about what Sustainable Westchester's Energize program talks about?
Sure. There you go, Lauren. If you're interested in having a free or reduced cost home energy assessment to your house, you can sign up through the Energize New York program. It's a great way to see how much energy your house is using and get a sense of how to make improvements. There's financing available through New York State, and it's no obligation, and anyone can do it. It doesn't matter about the sun or whatever. You can add insulation, do air sealing work, and upgrade your heating system so your energy bill goes down immediately. And is there anyone in the room that has an energized house? Yeah, so, and you guys love it?
Love it, love it.
Day one, your house is more comfortable, quieter, and then your bills are going down, so it's pretty good. Check it out.
Thank you, Lauren. All right.
Questions for our panelists? We've done enough advertising of the wonderful programs available in Westchester and Lansing.
Yes, sir.
It's a very easy observation to make, but if you're putting a charger in your garage and buying an electric car, or if you're putting a charger in a parking lot, you must absolutely make sure that you're also getting renewable energy to charge that. If your electricity is still being generated by a fossil fuel plant, you're really not accomplishing very much. So the two demands absolutely have to go in tandem if you're really going to make an impact.
For making that up, that should be this observation.
This is a question for John. I was just wondering how planning and zoning ties into this. And actually, I heard something today. I'm just going to throw one little answer to that, to the question. I was at an electric vehicle panel discussion this morning, and with the New York League of Conservation Voters, and they talked about municipalities requiring any new building to any new building of parking spaces or garages to require electric vehicle infrastructure, or have that built in and demand that as part of municipalities' building requirements. So I just thought you could comment more broadly on how planning ties in.
Thank you for the softball, I appreciate that. Some interesting facts to start with. Nationwide, we are responsible for about 24 metric tons of CO2 emissions per capita per year. If you live in Manhattan, you're responsible for about 7.1. So if you look at Westchester County, I know when this whole movement that Nancy is talking about tonight got started 10, 15 years ago in Bedford, they did a calculation of the metric tons of each individual in Bedford, and it was 35 metric tons of emissions that each individual was responsible for. We begin to look at that and try to figure out what is that due to, and it's really related to your question. Because 20% of CO2 comes from vehicles traveling all over the landscape, which we do a lot of in the suburbs, and 40% of it is used in buildings, commercial and residential buildings. So we start looking around for who is responsible for regulating buildings and for shaping the human settlement patterns, and it turns out it's the town of Austining, the village of Austining, and the other 43 municipalities in Westchester County. So all of a sudden, this explosion that Nancy's talking about at the level of solarize and other kinds of approaches to energy conservation is beginning to happen exactly in this form. In the local planning boards, they're beginning to look at idling, they're looking at parking, they're looking at, you know that there's 800 million parking spaces in this country and 330 million people? We're beginning to look at that and that reflection of the sun off of those parking lots and the ways that we could soften and green, we could put the park back into parking. There are all kinds of things that local governments are starting to do to make the buildings use less energy, to make the vehicles emit less CO2. And we're having a tremendous success with that in many, many municipalities. So thank you for the softball.
We've got some really low-tech things going on too. In the town of Mamaroneck, we decided to close the town center 2 nights a week so that we could turn off the lights, turn down the HVAC, and we asked everyone who was holding meetings there to just do it on the other 2 nights of the week or 3 nights of the week. And we saw a big change in our energy use just from that.
Aside from the discussion about producing carbons, was this really interesting article in the Times Magazine this weekend about dirt and about growing plants and filtering the air and basically absorbing back some of this carbon. What type of activities can we promote as a group to maybe not mow our lawn so much and cultivate plants that will help us in fighting the growing levels of carbon?
Just to put that number in the metrics that I was reflecting on a moment ago, 15% of CO2 is sequestered in this country by the natural environment. And once again, local governments can do a lot to increase the sequestering environment. And a lot of people are beginning to look at tree canopies, and individual property owners are looking at enlarging the amount of vegetation they have on their properties. And municipalities are beginning to look at how they can enlarge the green infrastructure of their places. And that's directly related to absorbing the CO2 that otherwise we're emitting. I don't know if you want to comment?
I'm going to be a little bit of a bummer. 50% of the CO2, the excess CO2 is actually being sequestered in the ocean, in the oceans. And so a lot of what we're seeing in terms of climate change, we're not seeing as much of it as we would if it was all in the atmosphere. There is some conversation that that there will be a kind of maximum ability of plant life to absorb CO2 depending on how high the concentrations of CO2 go. So the only thing that I would say in conjunction with this is the real first thing is to start limiting how much fossil fuels we're burning, because we can't expect natural processes which have existed under one kind of global chemistry to work in exactly the same way under the new chemistry that we've created. Sorry to be a bummer.
I wanted to just make a comment about climate change in our community also. You know, all of this was showing low-lying countries and countries covered with glaciers and all kinds of things like that. And those of us who are fortunate enough to travel and see those changes, it's stark and it's startling. But even in our communities, we're seeing it. I spent most of my career working on water quality issues for Long Island Sound. And we've seen a real change in the critters in Long Island Sound. We are at the lowest, most southern part of habitat for lobsters in Long Island Sound. They don't exist south of us as we know them or like to eat them. And they exist north of us. But in 1999, we had a huge die-off of lobsters in the Western Sound, and they've never recovered. They've never come back. And it wasn't just because of a shellfish disease, but it was because their temperature change in the bottom of the sound increased a small amount, and that caused a big, big problem for lobsters. And we see much more warm water fish species in Long Island Sound now than we ever have before, and far fewer northern or colder species of fish.
I want to just quickly leap on to that. One of the things that's really important in looking at the climate change, there's a lot of conversation about it where you'll hear projections of 100 years from now, this is happening, and 150 years. And I think one of the problems in terms of the absorption of the information and people being active about it is realizing it's happening to us here, right now. You know, the film we watched, Vice President Gore talked about Miami being the third, or being the first city in trouble from sea level rise in terms of assets. Miami's number one, number two is Guangzhou in China, number three is New York and Newark. The harbor, New York Harbor, is up 15 inches from what it was just at the turn of the century, according to the DEC. The Hudson River, which we know isn't a river until Troy, it's an estuary, the DEC says it's going to be up 71 inches by the end of the century. Things like Lyme, you know, the exact same things that we see with the main mosquito carrying Zika, which is it's more widespread, it feeds more often because its metabolism is sped up, it's having more breeding cycles, there's a larger and larger populations because of those breeding cycles. These are the exact same things we're seeing in deer ticks. So we're living with this, and we need to understand that. Also, because I know I'm the voice of doom right now, I want to tell you I'm also more hopeful about this crisis than I've ever been, and there are extraordinary reasons to be hopeful. This last week, for 5 days straight, the United Kingdom didn't burn any coal whatsoever. There are all kinds of things like that that are happening. And again, they're happening on the local level and in the basement of libraries, and this is where this is happening.
Thank you, Tim. We have time for one or two more questions. That usually gets people's hands up.
Yeah, I can raise my hand. Sure, yeah. My question, I actually went to the Climate Reality Leadership Training in Pittsburgh last fall. I was there with Susie and Tim. And I just wanted to know, Tim, how could someone in this room, how could they get involved with climate reality? That's my question.
Thank you for the softball. You can see any of the three of us. Climate Reality does these trainings. They're free. They have now trained about 14,000 people like us around the world. They just had a training in Mexico. They're having one in Berlin soon. At the end of August, there's a training at the end of August in Los Angeles. They're about 2.5, 3 days long. The training I went to, Mr. Gore was there, the first one, the head of the National Security Administration, the most extraordinary scientists, and it's really, just talk to any of us if you're interested. It's an extraordinary thing.
We have time for one last question.
This might be a bit too specific, but do you offer internships to high school students?
I do.
The Climate Reality Project has, it's a struggle. Like with any nonprofit, they're struggling for funding, and there's an absolute recognition of the necessity for that kind of help. One thing I will tell you is there are Climate Reality chapters, including one which has just been formed in Westchester, and people can join those chapters without going to those big trainings. And there's a million. You guys have Sierra Club and 350. There's a million. But I'm happy to talk to you about that stuff.
From a local level, I just want to add that most of us in the chief elected official positions, such as Victoria and Dana, are welcoming to interns for the summer or whenever. And I've actually had some high school interns who have done some amazing things for the town of Mamaroneck. They got us certified as a climate smart community. They initiated our food waste composting program. They've just done some wonderful things, and if they approach a community with a specific project, or go to a community's environmental committee and say, what kind of project do you think needs to be done here? We all love free help, I have to say. It's really helpful.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to ask if our panelists have any final comments that you'd like to share with us, anything that we should be paying attention to in the near future, or any thoughts that you've had in the last couple of hours you want to leave us with.
We spend most of our time working at the local level with people who are volunteers. I don't know how many of you know this, but every municipality in Westchester has a zoning board of appeals, a planning board, a local legislative body that's doing these kinds of things that you're hearing about, many architectural review boards, conservation advisory boards. And I'd just like to do a little shout out for all those volunteers that are at work doing the kind of things that we're talking about here tonight.
I want to congratulate all of you for being here, and thank you for being interested in it. And thank you to Victoria and Dana, because now I think Ossining is a cool place too.
I want to give a shout out for their next films, which I've seen 4 times in the past month. The Hope on the Hudson movies are extraordinary and come. I also just want to say, you know, at the end of the movie, Al Gore does that Wallace Stevens, I think, poem. After the final no, there comes a yes, and on the yes, the future world depends. What I want to say to you is that that yes is not some giant amorphous animal that may perhaps wander in and save us. That yes exists in all of your hearts. That yes is possibility that's in all of you and all of us. And we all have to find the specific path that will let our yes resonate. History's knocking on the door right now. It's an incredible moment, and there's a real question, which is, are you going to answer the door in your own way? Are you going to answer the door? I hope so. It makes me very hopeful to see all of you here tonight.
Thank you all so much for joining us. If I could get all of the documentary discussion series members to come up to the table with our